Hello again. Because I've had some harsh criticisms of the ideology of anti-racism, some of those who are opposed to me have jumped to the wholly erroneous conclusion that I must really be championing the antithesis of anti-racism, in other words, racism, and that by saying bad things about the idea of anti-racism, I am really advocating racism. This is, of course, complete nonsense. Anti-racism is a particular and pernicious ideology which tells us nothing at all about whether or not people are racist or not. It is a false ideology which has become very popular in the Western world. I thought that I would look into the roots of anti-racism in this video, which is likely to be longer than my usual ones. So those who have a short attention span might want to skip it. There have always been people who thought that the different ethnic groups of the world were alike in intellectual ability and that there were no inbuilt differences between black people and white, but they were probably few and far between and seldom rose to prominence throughout most of history. It wasn't until the 20th century that the ideology of racial equalitarianism took off. Chief among the pioneers in this new perspective was Franz Boas, the German-born anthropologist who spent most of his life in the United States. Franz Ural Boas was born in Prussia, which is now part of Germany, in 1858. His parents were Jewish, although not religiously observant. He began his academic career studying physics and geography, but then became interested in anthropology, which was at that time a fairly new discipline. After embarking upon a field trip to study the waters of the Arctic, Boas instead became fascinated by the Inuit people of Canada. A few years later, still in his 20s, he emigrated to the United States, in which country he spent the rest of his life. He is today known by some as the father of American anthropology. Boas' thinking has been enormously influential in anthropology and the idea of racism. He was, for instance, the mentor of, among others, Margaret Mead. In the early years of the 20th century, the traditional Victorian beliefs about scientific racism still held sway. It was thought that there was a strict hierarchy of both races and the cultures which they produced, with the Anglo-Saxons at the pinnacle of racial, intellectual, scientific, cultural and technological development. Franz Boas thought this a short-sighted and parochial perspective. He promoted instead the notion of cultural relativism, suggesting that there was no objective way of judging between different societies and cultures, and that all such opinions were subjective. Who was to say that the British, with their technologically advanced civilization, were actually a more worthy culture than that of the Aboriginal inhabitants of Australia? Such ideas may have been groundbreaking and revolutionary in the 1920s, but they are, of course, now the orthodox and accepted view of most educated people in the West. This led, almost as a matter of course, to the revolutionary thought that if this was the case with societies and cultures, could it also be true of the individuals who made up those populations? If the Inuit culture, or that of the Kalahari Bushmen, was in no way inferior to those of Britain or Germany, then why should we think that the men and women in those African or Canadian groups were somehow inferior intellectually or in any other way to, say, the British royal family? Perhaps cultural differences were all. Boas showed that the then popular idea about the world's races being distinct and separate, with particular physical features associated with each of them, was mistaken. He demonstrated that studying skull size and proportions, to which great importance had been attached when studying the different races into which mankind was supposedly divided, was little better than the old pseudoscience of phrenology. As far as it went, Boas' work was perfectly correct, and the way in which he dismantled the ideas relating to race, which had been riding high for a century or more, was masterful. He worked with the black sociologist and historian W. E. B. Du Bois, and with him was involved with the National Association for Coloured People, which was founded in the United States in 1909. Boas worked too with the researcher and inventor Booker T. Washington, who was also black. There's no doubt that he was quite indifferent to the colour of a man's skin and the culture from which he came, an admirable enough sentiment, but perhaps not a common one in America in the first half of the 20th century. Franz Boas was not the only person in the field of anthropology who was advancing the idea that the only differences between different ethnicities were cultural, and that culture alone could explain any supposed inferiority in intelligence. One of his students, Ruth Benedict, went on to enjoy a distinguished academic career herself and was able to advocate for cultural relativism from within Columbia University. Her 1934 book, Patterns of Culture, made her one of the most well-known anthropologists to hold such views. Because she was so well known for her standpoint on race in the years before the beginning of the Second World War, Benedict was commissioned by the United States Army to write a pamphlet called The Races of Mankind, which was originally intended to be distributed to all troops, with the aid of promoting harmonious relations between black soldiers and white as they fought together the common enemies of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. When completed, though, this piece of work was thought to be so revolutionary in the views expressed that it was quietly shelved. Reading the booklet today is fascinating because although Benedict wrote it almost 80 years ago in collaboration with a woman called Jean Weltfish, it presents the orthodox view which is widely accepted today by many in the field of sociology and anthropology also. At the time it was published, though, this was radical stuff indeed. The Races of Mankind emphasises that all differences across population groups are cultural and nothing more. A cartoon shows two boys, one scruffy and unkempt and living in a run-down neighbourhood, and the other presentable and smart. The tidy and clearly well-raised boy is depicted in front of a clean, prosperous street with a nice school. The caption is, "With better home-school medical care, Johnny could have been Jimmy." Another cartoon points out the indisputable fact that an American raised in China would speak Chinese. From these simple points, the argument moves on to race, and it is suggested that only physical differences exist between varying ethnic groups. Everything else, intelligence is specifically mentioned, is entirely environmental. A passage relating to intelligence is worth reading in its entirety, for it could have been written yesterday. Scientists then studied gifted children. They found that children with top scores turned up among Negroes, Mexicans and Orientals. Then they went to European countries to study the intelligence of children in homelands from which our immigrants come. Children from some of these countries got poor scores in America, but in their homelands they got good scores. Evidently, the poor scores here were due to being uprooted, speaking a foreign language and living in tenements. The children were not unintelligent by heredity. There is a great deal in Ruth Benedict's writing which has now been either proved to be incorrect or at the very least called into question. But the point has been made that the modern progressive view of race was already firmly established almost a century ago in the United States. In 1942, the year before Ruth Benedict wrote her pamphlet denouncing the idea of race as an actual biological phenomenon, a man who was a student of both her and Franz Boas published a book on the subject which is still in print to this day. Ashley Montagu's Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race, put forward the thesis that the whole idea of race has arisen for reasons of economic advantage, as it provided a handy justification for the slave trade. This may or may not be true, although it's very plausible. The important question, though, is not why this or that theory emerged at the time it did. We can explain the origin of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in similar terms and analyse why it became so popular when it did, rather than earlier or later. After all, no human idea emerges from a vacuum. All are the product of their historical period. Instead of asking ourselves why an idea becomes generally adopted at a particular point in human development, we might more profitably inquire as to the veracity of the idea and if it can be proved or disproved. Demonstrating that some set of economic factors made a hypothesis attractive to merchants trading in human merchandise is interesting from a sociological point of view, but tells us nothing useful about the accuracy or correctness of the hypothesis. I've outlined briefly some of the driving forces behind modern thinking on race. The ideology devised by academics like Franz Boas, Ruth Benedict and Ashley Montagu is still going strong today. Indeed, this is to dramatically understate the case. It has gone from strength to the point at which challenging or even asking too many questions about the subject has the effect of making people look askance and suspect racism. Many writers today simply repeat the assertions made by anthropologists in the 1930s and 40s, as though this is enough to prove, biologically speaking, that race is a myth, or race is a social construct. We pause at this point and consider two separate matters which both weaken the foundation of the towering and monolithic structure which is anti-racism in the Western world today. First, we remind ourselves that an awful lot has changed in the 80 years since man's most dangerous myth, the fallacy of race, was published. It was reasonable at that time for books like this and Ruth Benedict's summary of what was then modern research, which was provided for the American Army, to claim that the only difference between races are purely physical ones. How could it be otherwise? If the only tools you possess to examine differences between a black man and a white one are a pair of calipers, a ruler, and perhaps a colour chart, then clearly anything you uncover is likely to be crude physical measurements. Nobody at that time was able to analyse DNA, and intelligence tests were not as sophisticated as they are today. There is also the fact that the lives of black people in the United States were often very different from those of white people in terms of income, education and opportunity. It must have been very tempting to dismiss all apparent racial differences as either physical or cultural. These were, after all, the things which could be measured and catalogued. The chief difficulty, though, about anti-racism, as it is now accepted in the West, has nothing to do with new developments in any scientific field. It is that the core ideas which underpin the whole ideology are flawed and illogical. In other words, anti-racism today is fatally harmed by three logical fallacies which permeate the belief system and make it look increasingly untenable when examined objectively. The first of the logical fallacies, which Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict unwittingly embraced, is known as arguing from the particular to the universal. Let us suppose that I hold an irrational belief that all dogs are savagely aggressive and prone to biting people. I hold this view in contrast to my affection for cats, which I believe to be invariably affectionate creatures which never bite anybody. One day I meet a pleasant and good-tempered dog which, far from barking at me and taking a lump out of my leg, rubs itself against my legs and then jumps up to sit on my lap. I am now compelled to alter my opinions about dogs. I can no longer say that all dogs are aggressive, nor that they will, without exception, bite people. That, however, is all that I can say. I am familiar enough with cats, but having found that my strongly held antipathy to dogs was ill-founded, I can say nothing more than some dogs are not aggressive. I cannot go further than this, though, and state with assurance that dogs are no more likely to bite people than cats. That would be arguing from the particular to the universal, taking one instance and turning it into a general rule. Thinking about the hypothetical case above shows us that it would be easy to fall from one error into another. From thinking that all dogs were prone to biting and then changing one's opinion radically as a result of a limited refutation of the earlier theory might very well end with somebody being persuaded that dogs are no more likely to bite people than cats, which is of course false. The true state of affairs is that some dogs bite and so do some cats, but cats biting people is a very rare event, whereas dog bites are not at all rare. It comes down to a matter of statistics, and any generalization about all cats or all dogs is likely to be wrong. Drawing a general conclusion from one or two cases is what we mean by the expression, arguing from the particular to the universal. What bearing does this have on Franz Boas and the other anthropologists? It is simple. In the 1920s, the common view in Europe and America could probably be summed up as being that black people were dull-witted compared to white people. That was what many, perhaps most people, believed. Racial prejudice was the rule rather than the exception. There was less mixing of black people with white than is now the case, and so a lot of white people didn't socialise, attend church with, or live next door to black people. That people of African origin were of inferior intelligence was widely thought to be the case. Although few people other than sociologists or anthropologists ever stopped to think what they really understood this to mean, it amounted to this. Every black person was placed in a separate category to every white person and assumed to have particular qualities, especially relating to cognitive ability. Every black person, in other words, was supposedly the intellectual inferior of all white people. People like Franz Boas found through personal experience that this commonly held view was wrong, because he knew personally black people who were highly intelligent. If we meet only a few black people and they're highly educated and intelligent people, we might jump to the conclusion that highly educated and intelligent black people are as common as highly educated and intelligent white people. This is a debatable point, but it is certainly not a logical deduction to make after meeting one, two, or even half a dozen such people. Franz Boas was an academic, and although he carried out field trips among other cultures as a young man, in later years he tended to come into contact only with others working in academia. Through working with brilliant men such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who was black, Boas and others were assured that any sweeping generalization about all black people being less intelligent than white people was false. It could not be true that all black people were dull-witted. The correct deduction would have been that some black people were not dull-witted. To jump from this simple statement of truth to the position that black people were no more likely to be dull-witted than white people was a step too far. Just as in our earlier example of the man who thought that all dogs were ferocious, having discovered that one is not tells him only that he was mistaken in his previous ideas about the subject. This false conclusion still lies unremarked and unexamined at the heart of modern anti-racism. Meeting a black intellectual doesn't tell us anything at all about the distribution of intelligence in black people. We could not know from that single encounter whether high intelligence is as common in those of African heritage as it is in people of East Asian origin or Europeans. To establish that, we would need to carry out a great deal of research and many tests of intelligence across different parts of the world and with different ethnic groups. When this is actually done, the results do not on the whole suggest that cognitive ability is evenly divided in the way we might hope that it would be. The 2008 film Gran Torino, which was produced and directed by Clint Eastwood, provides us with a perfect instance of another failure of logic known as the fallacy of division. The protagonist of the film, played by Clint Eastwood, berates a young woman from Southeast Asia for what he regards as foolish and hazardous behaviour on her part. He says, "I thought you Asian girls were supposed to be smart." Here in a nutshell is the fallacy of division, the assumption that what is true of the whole must equally be true of the parts which make up the whole. Imagine that you meet a football player who is a member of a spectacularly successful team. You might perhaps say to yourself, wow, this man must be a sensational footballer. After all, his team is winning every match it plays. There are no grounds for this belief. It might be the case that the team has 5 or 6 members whose ability at the game is almost superhuman, and that the remaining players are slightly below average. Just because the man you meet belongs to a winning team tells you nothing useful about his own prowess at the game. The fact that people of Chinese origin tend to score more highly in IQ tests and other measures, including the passing of academic examinations, tells us something about the group as a whole. It does not enable us to make any assumptions about any individual person of East Asian heritage whom we meet. Nor does the fact that black people score in general lower marks in IQ tests and do not tend to do as well in academic examinations let us conclude that the next black person we meet will be less intelligent than the last white person we encountered. Of course, the commonly accepted view of the case today, at least among educated people in the West, is that there are no inherent differences in cognitive ability or anything else relating to the mind between one ethnicity and another. Whether a person is black or white, Asian or American, regardless of whether they were born into a family of bushmen in the Kalahari Desert or a prosperous middle-class home in a smart part of New York, all have equal potential and similar intelligence. All differences as a baby grows to adulthood are the product of upbringing and nurture. This is the equalitarian dogma, of course, which I shall speak about tomorrow. This may be the true state of affairs, but this is by no means certain. Let's look at another possibility. That most people of any ethnicity or nationality fall into a roughly comparable category of average intelligence is very likely to be the case. It is the proportions of the very intelligent and the very dull-witted, though, which might differ. These are small numbers compared with the overall population. In any given group of people, almost all will fall more or less in the zone marked average. At one end are a few who are very clever, and at the other a small number who are very slow. This picture holds good for white people, black people, and those from Asia. There is some reason to suppose that people whose families have their origin in East Asia might have more people in the group who are very intelligent, and perhaps fewer in the category at the other end, the ones who are unusually slow-witted or have learning difficulties. Perhaps their average IQ will accordingly be a little higher than the average for white people. There is some reason to suppose that this is the case, but the evidence is fragmentary and uncertain. Although the educational data suggests that there may be differences of the sort discussed above, we cannot be sure. But if it is so, then the group containing black people, that is to say those of African origin, will contain a greater number of individuals who are slower and fewer at the very bright end of the spectrum. This is what we seem to observe in schools, and it also appears to be the case when aptitude tests and IQ tests are administered. The truth is that whatever IQ you care to mention, from 50 to 150, there will be black people and white who share that level of measured intelligence. There will also be people of Indian origin, Hispanics, and those whose families have their roots in China, all of them with that same IQ. This indisputable fact can lead unwary people to leap from one false supposition to another, which is equally wrong and ill-founded. In the little fantasy at which we looked above, a man jumped from the position of thinking that all dogs were more aggressive and liable to bite him than all cats, to the belief that dogs were no more likely to bite him than cats were. This skewed and inaccurate view was based upon very limited experience, and we saw that it is the logical fallacy of arguing from the particular to the universal. Precisely the same thing can happen with race and intelligence. Let's look now at another flaw in the logic of those who might be said to be the founders of the modern anti-racism movement. It was observed in the 1920s that black people in America did not do as well educationally as white people. This attitude led to white civil authorities spending far less on black schools than on white ones. Now, the substandard schooling which black children received in much of the southern part of the United States might well have been responsible for the fact that the IQs of black children and adults, which were measured at that time, were on the whole lower than those of white people. This is possible, but not certain. A genuine deficit, even a fairly slight one, would also explain this. The hypothesis which one chose in 1930s America for those differing IQ scores depended less upon reason and logic than they did upon ideology and politics. One possibility, that embraced by many white people, was that the inherent intellectual ability of black people was limited, and this explained why in adulthood they had on the whole lower IQs than white people. There were those, though, especially anthropologists like Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict, who were champions of cultural relativism and thought that if black children and white were given equal opportunities with access to schools of the same quality, then there would inevitably be equality of educational outcome and also intelligence. Of course, poverty can be a product of prejudice and denied opportunity, but it is also the case that those less intellectually gifted also often have lower incomes and so are more likely to fall into destitution than the average genius. We can see poverty as a cause of intellectual impoverishment, which is what cultural relativists are apt to do, but it is also undeniably true that the dull-witted are at greater hazard of poverty than others, and that poverty can then be a consequence of a lower IQ. To assume one of these possibilities over the other is to fall into the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which is to think that because one thing precedes another, the first thing caused the second. The classic example of this is usually given as the building of a new church steeple in Kent in the 16th century. Sir Thomas More had been sent to investigate the reason that the harbour of the port of Sandwich in southern England was silting up, and he spoke to the oldest inhabitant in the district, hoping he might be able to shed light on the matter. We cannot do better than quote what William Mint, a Victorian logician, wrote about the incident. More asked him what he had to say as to the cause of the sands. "Forsooth, sir," was the grey-beard's answer, "I am an old man. I think that Tenterden steeple is the cause of the Goodwin sands. For I am an old man, and I remember the building of Tenterden steeple, and I remember when there was no steeple at all there. And before that Tenterden steeple was in building, there was in no manner of speaking any flats or sands that stopped up the haven. And therefore I think that Tenterden steeple is the cause of the destroying and decaying of Sandwich Haven." It's not being suggested that Ruth Benedict was as foolish as the old man from Kent during the time of the Tudors, but her deduction was no more rational. In the pamphlet which she produced during the Second World War, Benedict explicitly stated her firm belief about material conditions in childhood being the only significant factor in the development of intelligence, and also made rather a rash prediction, one which can be measured today. Discussing the discovery made during the First World War that black and white conscripts usually had different scores in intelligence tests, with most of the white soldiers doing better than the majority of black men, Benedict had this to say: "Since the vast majority of Negroes lived in the South, their score on the intelligence test was a score they got not only as Negroes, but as Americans who had grown up under poor conditions in the South." She then went on to make a statement which was to become dogma in the coming years. The differences did not arise because people were from the North or the South, or because they were white or black, but because of differences in income, education, cultural advantage, and other opportunities. For much of the United States post-war history, this is the doctrine which has been sedulously followed by successive governments, both Democrat and Republican. If only, it is thought, conditions of equality prevail between black and white, then equality of outcome will arrive as a matter of course. Closing what has become known as the attainment gap, which is the difference in educational outcomes and achievement between white people and black, has, for more than 60 years, been an unattainable goal. It is beginning to look to some So the enterprise is a hopeless one, the pursuit of a mirage which recedes into the distance as rapidly as it is approached. This is the point that we are at today, that the idea of anti-racism has become fixed in the minds of most educated people who perhaps have not thought deeply about it enough to realise that the doctrine is founded upon some very serious logical fallacies. It has in effect solidified or fossilised into a dogma, and tomorrow I'm going to discuss the nature of that dogma, which is sometimes known as the equalitarian dogma.